The Philippines will likely post the highest growth among Southeast Asian countries despite the projected economic slowdown this year, according to the latest report issued by the World Bank and Asian Development Bank. The GDP growth in the Philippines is projected to moderate to 5.6% in 2023 from 7.6% in 2022 due to still elevated inflation, tight financial conditions, and a weak external environment. The World Bank's latest forecast was lower than its 6% earlier projection, but despite the downgrade, the growth of the Philippine economy is projected to outpace Cambodia, 5.5%, Indonesia, 5%, Vietnam, 4.7%, Malaysia, 3.9%, Laos, 3.7%, Thailand, 3.4%, and Myanmar, 3.0%. For the first 3 quarters of 2023, the Philippines is still the growth leader among the major economies in the region with an average growth of 5.5%, followed by Indonesia growing by 5.05% for the first 9 months this year. Vietnam with an average growth of 4.2%, comes next as Malaysia growing an average of 3.9%, Thailand expanding by 2% and Singapore by 0.53%. Mirroring the global downward trend in the third quarter of 2023, growth slowed in 2 of the 6 countries' economies, Indonesia and Thailand. While GDP grew in the Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia and Singapore, from the second quarter to the third. Private consumption was the key driver of growth in most of these countries, especially in Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines, where their share in the economy ranges between 60 to 70%. Weakening global demand contracted exports across most of the region. Singapore is one of the most affected economies given its high dependence on exports at 187% of GDP, followed by Vietnam and Malaysia, at 94% and 74% of GDP respectively. The tourism sector, however, is accelerating as the number of foreign visitors to Southeast Asia continues to increase. This is particularly important for Thailand, where tourism is one of their key sectors and prior to the pandemic, contributed 20% to GDP in 2019. The Asian Development Bank, ADB, has kept its economic growth forecasts for the Philippines for this year and next year, but expects the country to have the highest growth rate in Southeast Asia. In its Asian Development Outlook report for December released yesterday, the multilateral lender said it expects the economy to grow by 5.7% this year, unchanged from the gross domestic product, GDP, growth forecast it provided last September. If this is realized, the Philippines will be the fastest growing economy in Southeast Asia this year, as the multilateral lender has lower forecasts for other countries in the region, such as Vietnam at 5.2%, Indonesia at 5%, Malaysia at 4.2%, Thailand at 2.5%, and Singapore at 1%. The ADB's 2023 economic growth forecast for the Philippines, however, is lower than the government's 6 to 7% growth target for this year. For next year, the ADB also retained its growth forecast for the Philippines at 6.2%. This forecast places the Philippines ahead of its peers in the region, as ADB is projecting Vietnam will grow by 6%, Indonesia by 5%, Malaysia by 4.6%, Thailand by 3.3%, and Singapore by 2.5% next year. ADB's 2024 GDP growth forecast for the Philippines is within the 6.5 to 8% growth goal set by the government for next year. The economy continues to be supported by domestic demand. The economy grew by 5.9% in the third quarter, bringing the average growth for the January to September period to 5.5%. This momentum is expected to continue, despite tighter financial conditions. It said higher public investment, rising consumer spending, especially on hotels or restaurants and tourism activities amid a strong recovery of international tourism across Southeast Asia, will lift growth in the Philippines. The ADB expects infrastructure projects that are underway to support growth. It also cited the more upbeat business outlook for 2024 on expectations of buoyant domestic demand based on the central bank's third quarter survey. In terms of the inflation outlook, the ADB also maintained its forecasts for the Philippines at 6.2% for this year and 4% for next year. Headline inflation in the country eased to a 20-month low of 4.1% in November from 4.9% in October. The fourth quarter performance will be a setting point if the emerging ASEAN markets can achieve their 2023 economic goals. Only Indonesia had reached its forecast in the first 3 quarters, growing at an average rate of 5.05% compared to the 5% full-year economic outlook. The Philippines is required to expand by 7.4% in the fourth quarter to achieve its lower-end outlook of 6% for 2023. The Philippine government forecast its economy to grow by 6 to 7% this year. Likewise, Vietnam, with an optimistic outlook at the beginning of the year, expecting to expand by 6.5% full year, now requires a 13.4% GDP growth in the fourth quarter to offset lossy growth in the first 3 quarters. Malaysia's average growth rate in the first 9 months also failed to reach its economic goal set at the beginning of the year of 4%, growing only by 3.9%. Malaysia's economy is required to expand at least 4.2% to reach its 2023 full-year economic outlook. Thailand, whose outlook lowered twice this year to 2.7%, is required to expand by 4.8% in the fourth quarter to reach its economic outlook. Singapore, the worst performer in the region, is required to expand by 2.4% in the fourth quarter to achieve its 1% full-year economic outlook for 2023. The economies in ASEAN are expected to see growth of 4.2% in 2023 and 4.6% in 2024, a downward revision of 0.4 percentage points in 2023 and 0.3 percentage points in 2024, relative to our April World Economic Outlook. The downgrade reflects not only weaker growth outlooks and external demand, but also more lackluster domestic demand because of waning revenge consumption and monetary policy tightening. In the longer term, the Philippines is projected to land in the top 15 largest economies in the world by 2075, as emerging markets are projected to outgrow their developed counterparts. In a report released last month, Goldman Sachs said it forecasts the Philippines to be the 14th largest economy in the world by 2075, surpassing France, which is projected to fall to the 15th spot by that year. The Philippines is one of the 2 Southeast Asian nations on the list, with Indonesia seen to become the world's 4th largest economy by 2075. The Philippines is often referred to as a country from which the export of services rather than manufactured goods is the principal engine for economic growth. The ITBPO industry and the services provided by overseas Filipino workers constitute to almost 20% of the country's GDP. According to the IT and Business Process Association of the Philippines, the total ITBPO headcount reached 1.6 million in 2022, with revenues for the sector rising to $32.5 billion. For the record, the country holds 10% market share of the global ITBPO market. Emerging economies, led by powerhouses in Asia, are growing more quickly than developed ones, even as expansion in real global GDP slows. Their share of the world economy will continue to rise, and their incomes are expected to slowly converge toward those of richer countries. Meanwhile, China and India are projected to be the first and second largest economies in the world, respectively, by 2075 and surpass the United States, which would take the 3rd spot. Accordingly, China would overtake the US around 2035, while India should catch up by 2075. While China and India are projected to be larger than the US in terms of economic size by 2075, Goldman Sachs projections imply that the US will remain more than twice as rich in terms of per capita compared to China and India. Among the emerging markets in East and Southeast Asia, the Philippines will have the highest average growth between 2024 to 2030 at 6%, followed by India at 5.8%, Indonesia at 4.3%, and China at 4%. Improving domestic demand in Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines has helped to support the rebound in economic growth momentum during the first half of 2023. Over the long run, the ASEAN region is expected to overcome the protracted negative economic shocks caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, and continue to be one of the fastest-growing regions of the world economy. This rapid pace of growth will be driven by both exports and domestic demand. Highlighting the increasing importance of ASEAN region as one of the world's largest consumer markets. By 2040, ASEAN's share to world GDP is projected to increase to 5.4% of world's economy. According to S&P Global, before 2040, the Philippines and Thailand will join Indonesia on the roster of major global economies, reaching over $1 trillion of nominal GDP. The Philippines is forecast to become one of the Asia-Pacific region's small group of $1 trillion economies by 2033. While Thailand will join in this grouping of the largest economies in APAC by 2036. Other countries in Asia-Pacific region with over $1 trillion economies are China, Japan, India, South Korea, Australia, and Taiwan. Consequently, the outlook for the Philippines economy over the next decade is very favorable, with significant progress in economic development is expected. Rapidly rising per capita GDP and standards of living will help to underpin a broad improvement in human development indicators, and will deliver a significant reduction in the share of the population living in extreme poverty over the decade ahead. The Philippines is poised to become the world's 18th biggest economy by 2050, as long as it addresses its infrastructure lack. A long-term projection, made by London-based macroeconomic research organization, Capital Economics. Meanwhile, rising per capita GDP levels will also put pressures on Thailand's competitiveness in certain segments of its manufacturing export industry. Therefore, an important policy priority for nation will continue to transform manufacturing export industries towards higher value-added processing in advanced manufacturing industries. The World in 2050 report issued by PwC enumerated the latest long-term global growth projections to 2050 for 32 of the largest economies in the world, accounting for around 85% of world's economy. Accordingly, the Philippines and Vietnam make the greatest moves up in the ranking amongst the major economies in Southeast Asia. The Philippines will rank 19th globally, inching up by 9 places from the 28th spot in 2016, while Vietnam will rank 20th globally with an outstanding rise which ranks up by 12 places, from the 32nd spot in 2016. Other ASEAN states which takes part in the major global economies are Indonesia, which ranked 4th. Malaysia ranked in 24th place, and followed by Thailand in 25th spot. The World in 2050 reported that Indonesia will still remain the biggest economy in the region by 2050 with a GDP measured in nominal terms amounting to $7.3 trillion, followed by the Philippines with a GDP of $2.5 trillion, Vietnam with an economy reaching $2.3 trillion, Malaysia with an economy of $2.1 trillion, and Thailand with GDP of $2 trillion.